Tell me whose name you whispered while I was in that delivery room, fighting for our daughter's life.
Amara, it's not what you think.
Whose name, Michael?
The silence in that hospital corridor lasted only 4 seconds. It felt like 4 years, 2 women, 2 due dates, 80 kilometers apart, separated by less than 6 hours. One man who promised both of them forever and never once told either woman the other existed. For 5 years, Amara Chukwu believed she had built a marriage on solid ground. She had no idea her husband had built a second house on the same foundation, with another woman's name on the deed. What she didn't yet know was that the worst betrayal wasn't the affair. It wasn't even the secret child. It was the choice Michael would make 6 years later, in a hospital corridor, when both of his daughters needed him at the exact same moment. A choice that would force him to finally say out loud which family he had truly chosen all along. What he did next broke her more than the betrayal itself ever could. Please sit back, relax, as we dive fully into this really remarkable story. Amara Chukwu was 29 years old when she believed, for the first time in her life, that she had finally found safety. She had grown up in Enugu, the eldest of 4 children raised by a widowed mother who sold fabric in Ogbit Market to keep them fed. Her father died when she was 9, a transport accident, sudden and final, the kind of loss that doesn't just take a person but rearranges the entire architecture of a household around the hole he leaves behind. Amara remembered, with painful clarity, the months that followed. Her mother's hands shaking as she counted Naira notes at the kitchen table late at night, the way laughter disappeared from their home for almost a year, the way she herself quietly stopped being a child and became a second mother to her younger siblings without anyone ever asking her to. She learned early that love was not a guarantee. It was something fragile, something you worked for, something that could disappear in the time it took an Okada to swerve on a wet road. That lesson followed her into adulthood like a shadow she never quite outran, shaping the careful, watchful way she loved fully, but always with one eye on the door. By 26, Amara had built a modest, steady life in Lagos, working as an accountant for a mid-sized logistics firm, sending money home every month without being asked, still wearing her late father's old wristwatch even though it no longer kept accurate time. She had dated before, briefly, cautiously, but always pulled back the moment things began to feel like they required a kind of trust she wasn't sure she had left to give. Then she met Michael Ez. It happened at a wedding in Lekki, a mutual friend's elaborate 3-day affair, full of a so ebai and live bands and more jollof rice than the entire compound could finish. Michael was seated 2 tables away, laughing at something with the easy, unguarded warmth of a man entirely comfortable in his own skin. He wore a tailored charcoal suit that fit him the way good tailoring fits a man who has never had to think twice about money, and when their eyes met across the reception hall, he didn't look away first. Neither did she. He found her later by the dessert table, where she was deliberating with absurd seriousness between 2 slices of cake. "Take both," he said. "Life's too short to choose under pressure." "That your philosophy for everything or just cake? Depends what's at stake," he said, smiling in a way that made the corners of his deep brown eyes crease. "For cake, definitely both. For anything that actually matters, I take my time. I don't like getting things wrong. How do you know when you've gotten something right?" "You don't really," he admitted. "You just stop wanting to check the exits." She laughed at that, surprised by how disarming his honesty felt. "That's either the most romantic or the saddest thing anyone said to me tonight." "Let's call it romantic," he said. "I'd like tonight to end well." They talked for nearly 2 hours, long after the band switched from highlife to Afrobeats, long after most of the older guests had drifted home. He asked about Enugu, about her father, about the wristwatch she kept absently turning on her wrist, a habit she didn't realize she had until he pointed it out. "It stopped working years ago," she admitted. "I just like having it close. Then it's working exactly the way it's supposed to," he said quietly, and something in the way he said it made her chest tighten in a way she wasn't prepared for. For the next 3 weeks, their talking stage played out almost entirely over the phone, late-night calls that stretched past midnight, voice notes sent during work breaks. The slow, deliberate unspooling of 2 people testing whether the connection they'd felt at that wedding could survive daylight and distance. "I have to ask you something, and I need an honest answer," Michael said one night, 3 weeks in, his voice unusually serious. "Okay, You the kind of person who disappears when things get hard, or the kind who stays and fights for it? Amara was quiet for a moment. I'm the kind of person who's been left enough times to know exactly how much it costs. So if I stay, and I'm telling you now, I will stay, I need to know you're not the kind of person who leaves quietly and lets me find out the hard way. I'm not, Michael said, without a single second of hesitation. She believed him completely. She had no reason not to. She would replay that exact phone call, years later, turning that I'm not over and over in her memory like a coin she couldn't decide was real or counterfeit, wondering, with a bitterness she never fully expected to feel, exactly when the lie inside that promise had started. Their courtship moved with the unhurried confidence of two people who had each, in their own way, grown tired of relationships that demanded performance. Michael was a rising real estate developer, founder of Crestline Properties, a company that had in just 6 years transformed 3 derelict plots in Lekki into some of the most sought-after residential developments in Lagos. He was the kind of man rooms reorganized themselves around, not because he demanded it, but because his certainty was simply contagious. Amara watched him build that certainty from the ground up, watched him negotiate land disputes with elderly chiefs and soothe panicked investors, and personally walk every construction site himself, in scuffed boots beneath pressed trousers, because he didn't trust reports he hadn't verified with his own eyes. You like control, she told him once, half joking. Like certainty, he corrected. Control is about fear. Certainty is about knowing the ground is solid before you build on it. She found that distinction beautiful at the time. She would later wonder whether Michael had simply never applied that same philosophy to the people in his life, whether he had built his entire empire on solid ground while deliberately leaving the foundations of his own heart unstable. Load-bearing walls held up by nothing but timing and luck. They married 18 months after that wedding reception, in a small, intimate ceremony Amara's mother cried through from the first hymn to the last. Within 2 years, Amara was pregnant with their first child. Michael rubbed cocoa butter into her growing belly every night without fail, his large hands moving in slow circles, whispering promises to a daughter who hadn't yet taken her first breath. She's going to have your strength, he'd murmur against her stomach, his voice dropping into a register she rarely heard, soft and unguarded. And my stubbornness. God help us all. Amara would laugh genuinely, completely unaware that the man making those promises was already living a second life she knew nothing about, one with its own house key in Victoria Island, its own routine, its own child quietly growing in another woman's body, 4 months behind her own. The storm had already begun. And it was silent. Her name was Florence Adiz, lead interior designer on a luxury estate Crestline was developing in Lekki Phase 1. A project that would, with bitter irony, later become the very development that exposed everything Michael had spent years trying to keep separate. Florence moved through the world like she'd never once doubted it would catch her. She wore a shimmering emerald gown to the estate's investor launch, laughed loudly enough to turn heads across crowded rooms, carried an ambition that matched Michael's own appetite for more. It didn't begin as anything dramatic. That was the most unsettling part of it. There was no single moment Michael could point to later as the beginning. Only accumulations. A site visit that ran long, a dinner to discuss budgets that became 2 glasses of wine, a confession from Florence about her own difficult childhood that mirrored, eerily, conversations he used to have with Amara before those conversations had curdled into routine. He told himself, the way men tell themselves comfortable lies, that he wasn't betraying anyone. Amara was his home, his peace, solid ground he genuinely loved standing on. Florence was something else. Adrenaline, the thrill of being wanted urgently by a woman who hadn't yet grown tired of his flaws. By the time Amara was 4 months pregnant, Michael was 6 weeks into an affair he'd convinced himself was a fever that would burn out before anyone got hurt. He did not plan for Florence to get pregnant 4 months after Amara did. He did not plan for both due dates to land in the same brutal window of the same April. And he did not plan for that window to force the choice this story opened with, the one that would finally answer, in the cruelest way possible, which family he had truly chosen all along. The contractions started at 2:47 in the morning, 11 days before Amara's due date. Michael wasn't home. He'd told her he was driving to Abuja for a site inspection, a lie practiced enough to come out smoother than the truth would have. In reality, he was 40 minutes away in Victoria Island, in a hospital waiting room of his own, where Florence had gone into labor 6 hours earlier and was now demanding, in growing panic, to know exactly where he'd disappeared to Amara's sister Ngozi, drove her through the dark, gripping the wheel while Amara breathed through contractions arriving in sharp, relentless waves. She called Michael 14 times on that drive. Rang and rang into a silence she would later recognize as the loudest warning she ever chose not to hear. He answered on the 15th call, his voice tight and rushed in a register she'd never heard from him in 6 years. "Amara, I'm coming. I'm so sorry. Something happened. I'm coming." "Something happened where, Michael? You said you were in Abuja." Pause lasted only seconds. But Amara, who had spent her life reading the spaces between people's words, heard everything she needed to hear inside it. She gave birth to their daughter, Chidera, at 6:14 that morning. 3 hours of labor endured almost entirely alone, except for her sister's hand and a night nurse humming an old hymn through her hardest pushes. Michael arrived at 9:30, 3 hours and 16 minutes late, his shirt creased, his eyes hollow, carrying a bouquet of white lilies that suddenly looked obscene in his trembling hands. Amara looked at him over the small, sleeping bundle in her arms. "Whose name did you call, Michael?" "While you were standing in some other room, waiting for some other woman to push your child into this world, whose name did you call?" He didn't answer. He didn't have to. Shame is like a hand closing slowly around a man's throat. And Michael Ez stood frozen in that doorway, the lilies trembling in his grip, finally understanding that some truths don't need to be spoken to be heard. Michael did not lie again after that morning in the recovery room. In a strange, cruel way, it was the only mercy he offered Amara in those first devastating hours. He simply told her everything, standing at the foot of her hospital bed while their newborn daughter slept against her chest, because he no longer had the strength to build another lie on top of the one that had just collapsed. "Her name is Florence," he said quietly. "She works for Crestline. She gave birth 6 hours before you did." "A boy, I named him David." Amara said nothing for a long moment. The machines beside her bed beeped in steady, indifferent rhythm, the only sound marking the seconds of silence that followed. 6 hours, she finally repeated, her voice flat, hollowed out. "You knew weeks ago this was coming, and you let me call you 14 times last night, not knowing whether I'd survive giving birth to your daughter alone, while you sat in another hospital waiting for your son. I didn't plan for it to happen this way. You didn't plan for me to find out, Michael. That's different from not planning for any of this to happen. You planned plenty, you just never planned on getting caught. Amara, I never stopped loving you. You have to believe that. Don't have to believe anything you tell me ever again," she said, and for the first time in 6 years together, her voice didn't shake when she said something that hurt. "That's the one thing you've actually given me clarity about." He had no answer for that because there wasn't one. Some truths arrive so cleanly, so undeniably true, that even the person who caused them has nothing left to offer in their own defense. Amara asked him to leave the room. He did, without argument, the bouquet of white lilies left forgotten on the windowsill, where a nurse would later throw them away without anyone noticing they'd ever been there at all. A small, quiet metaphor for the marriage itself, abandoned in a room nobody returned to clean up properly. In the weeks that followed, everyone in Amara's life expected her to leave. Her sister Ngozi packed a bag for her, unasked, and left it by the door of the hospital room like a silent argument. Her mother called from Enugu, voice trembling with a fury she'd carried since her own husband's death had taught her exactly how little security a woman could count on from a man's promises. "Leave him, Amara. Come home. We'll manage." Amara, holding her newborn daughter through long, sleepless nights, found herself wrestling with a calculation more complicated than anger alone could resolve. Lagos, for all its modernity, still carried the weight of old expectations. She had no family wealth behind her, only a junior accountant's salary and a husband whose name was on every document that mattered. The apartment lease, the car, even the small savings account she'd contributed to faithfully for years. Leaving wasn't simply a matter of pride. It was a matter of survival, and Amara had learned as a 9-year-old girl in Enugu exactly how unforgiving survival could be when you moved too quickly, without a plan. "Not staying because I forgive him," she told Ngozi, 2 weeks after Chidera's birth, her voice steady even as exhaustion hollowed her eyes. I'm staying because I need time to build something that's mine before I walk away from everything that's his. I watched our mother lose everything overnight when Papa died with no warning and no preparation. I won't do that to my daughter. When I leave, and I will leave eventually, I'll leave on my own terms with my own ground beneath me. It was not forgiveness. It was strategy, born from a childhood that had taught her the brutal cost of leaping before you'd secured your landing. And so, Amara made a choice that would define the next 6 years of her life. Not the choice to forgive Michael, but the choice to quietly, patiently, build an exit that nobody could ever take from her again. What followed was not the dramatic, screaming rupture one might expect from a betrayal of this magnitude. Amara was not a woman built for screaming. Her devastation took a quieter, more devastating shape. A careful, methodical withdrawal that left Michael standing outside a marriage he hadn't fully understood the value of until it was already gone. Michael, for his part, did not abandon Florence and their son David either. He could not bring himself to walk away from a child he had helped create, regardless of the circumstances of that creation. And so began 6 years of an arrangement that satisfied no one and slowly hollowed out everyone involved. He maintained 2 households, 2 routines, a daughter and a son who grew up 80 kilometers apart, aware of each other only in the vague, unspoken way children sense things adults try to hide from them. He split his time with the careful precision of a man trying to balance a ledger that could never actually be balanced, because love, unlike money, doesn't divide cleanly. It either grows or it starves, and trying to split it in half only ever guarantees that both halves go hungry. Amara watched this arrangement consume her husband from the inside, watched the certainty that had once defined him curdle slowly into something brittle and apologetic. She stopped asking him where he'd been. She stopped waiting up. She built her own quiet fortress around herself and her daughter, learning the way she'd learned everything important in her life, to survive without depending on anyone's promises holding. "Do you still love me?" Michael asked her once, 4 years into the arrangement, on one of the rare nights they sat together in the same room without arguing. Amara considered the question with the same careful honesty she brought to everything. "I love who you used to be," she said. "I'm not sure that man exists anymore. I think you split him in half the same way you split everything else, and I don't know which half I'm looking at, Michael. I don't think you know either." "I want to fix this. Tell me how to fix this." "You can't fix a foundation by apologizing to it," she said quietly. "You fix it by never cracking it in the first place. That window already closed. What's left now isn't repair. It's just 2 people deciding how long to keep standing in a house they both know is condemned." He had no answer for that, the same way he'd had no answer in the hospital room years earlier. Some truths simply arrived too clean to argue with. Chidera grew into a quiet, watchful child, sharp-eyed, observant, carrying in small, specific ways the same careful guardedness her mother had carried since her own childhood. She adored her father in the uncomplicated, unconditional way young children do, unaware for most of her early years that his absences carried a weight far heavier than ordinary business travel. She was 6 years old when she first asked her mother, with the devastating directness only children possess, "Does Daddy have another little girl somewhere?" Tobai at school said his uncle has 2 families and nobody's allowed to talk about it. Amara had knelt down to her daughter's level, choosing her words with the same careful precision she chose everything. "Your father has a son," she said gently. "His name is David. You don't have to talk about it if you don't want to, but I never want you to feel like you have to hide the truth, baby. Hiding the truth is what got us here in the first place." "Daddy loved David more than me?" The question landed like a small, devastating stone dropped into still water. Amara felt her chest tighten, the old childhood instinct to protect rising in her even as she forced herself to answer honestly rather than comfortingly. "I don't know what's in your father's heart, Chidera," she said carefully. "But I know what's in mine, and I know you are loved completely, every single day, by at least one parent who will never make you doubt it. That has to be enough for now." Chidera absorbed this information with the quiet seriousness of a child far older than her years, filing it away in the particular way children file away information too big to fully process yet, but too important to ever forget. 80 kilometers away, David grew up in Florence's household with a different version of the same complicated truth. A father who arrived and disappeared on a schedule David never fully understood. A mother whose ambition and resentment had, over the years, calcified into a sharp, simmering bitterness that occasionally found its way into the things she said about Amara and Chidera in front of her son, never realizing, or perhaps not caring, what those comments were teaching a young boy about the family he wasn't supposed to know. "That woman thinks she's better than us because she got the wedding," Florence said once, not quite under her breath, while 6-year-old David sat coloring at the kitchen table. "She doesn't know what it costs to be the one nobody chose first." David didn't fully understand the comment. But he understood, even then, that there was a hierarchy somewhere in his family that he existed on the wrong side of, and that understanding would calcify, slowly, into something far more dangerous than ordinary childhood insecurity. "Why doesn't Daddy live here all the time, like other daddies?" David asked once, around age 7, watching Michael's car pull out of their compound after a brief Sunday visit. Florence's jaw tightened in the particular way it always did before she said something she would later regret teaching her son to believe. "Because there's another house, with another little girl who got there first," she said. "It's not fair, David. None of this was ever fair to you. Don't let anyone tell you it was." It was not the kind of wound that bled immediately. It was the kind that festered quietly for years, hardening into resentment David carried without fully understanding its weight. A resentment that would, eventually, demand to be answered. For nearly 6 years, the arrangement held fragile, exhausting, but held. Michael built a careful, compartmentalized rhythm. Weekdays largely with Amara and Chidera, weekends split with mathematical precision between both households, school events attended with apologetic punctuality, birthdays celebrated separately to avoid the inevitable collision of two families who were never meant to occupy the same room. It was, in its own bleak way, a kind of equilibrium, the sort of unstable peace that exists not because the underlying problem has been solved, but because everyone involved has simply grown exhausted enough to stop actively fighting it. Amara had, by this point, built something of her own outside the marriage. A small but growing accounting consultancy she'd started 2 years earlier, serving a handful of independent retailers in Lekki and Aikcha. It wasn't Crestline-sized. It wasn't meant to be. But it was hers, built without Michael's money or Michael's name attached to it, and there was a particular, quiet satisfaction in watching it grow steadily, proof that she had never actually needed the ground he'd promised her all those years ago at that wedding reception. She had built her own. "You don't need him anymore," her sister Ngozi told her one evening, watching Amara close out a client's books at the kitchen table while Chidera did homework nearby. "You haven't needed him for years." "Why are you still here?" Amara looked up, her expression tired but clear-eyed in a way it hadn't been in years. "Because Chidera still needs a father who shows up," she said. "And because I'm waiting for the day he finally has to choose, out loud in front of everyone, not quietly, not in installments, but completely. I want him to look both of his children in the eye and tell them the truth about which one matters more to him. I think some part of him has been avoiding that moment for 6 years. I don't think he'll be able to avoid it forever." She had no way of knowing, that evening, just how soon that moment was coming, or how catastrophically it would arrive, in a single impossible night, when both of Michael's children would need him at the exact same moment, in the exact same kind of crisis that had once split this family apart from the very beginning. The silence of those 6 years had been building toward something. And like every storm that begins silent, it was about to announce itself all at once. It started, as most catastrophic things do, on an otherwise ordinary evening. It was a Thursday in November, the kind of thick, humid Lagos night that makes the air feel like something you have to push through rather than breathe. Amara was at the kitchen table, Chidera's school report spread open beside her laptop, a cup of tea gone cold at her elbow. Chidera herself was in bed, slightly feverish since the previous evening, nothing alarming, just the stubborn low-grade temperature that circulated through primary school classrooms every Harmattan season without fail. Michael had promised to come home early. He had not come home early. Amara had stopped registering surprise at this particular disappointment years ago. She had simply added it to the long, quiet ledger of things she no longer expected from him. Late arrivals, broken small promises, the specific loneliness of being in a marriage where you'd learned to stop looking toward the door. She was checking Chidera's temperature for the 3rd time that evening, 38.4 degrees, climbing slightly from 38.1 an hour earlier when her phone rang. Michael's name lit up the screen. "I'm on my way," he said before she could speak. "I know I'm late. The Aegis site had an issue. I'm coming now." "Chidera's temperature is going up," Amara said, her voice measured. 38.4. "I'm going to take her to the hospital if it hits 39. "I'm 20 minutes away. Wait for me." She waited. At 39.1 degrees, she stopped waiting, wrapped her daughter in a light blanket, and was lifting her toward the door when Michael finally walked in, not 20 minutes later, but 53 minutes after that phone call, his tailored charcoal suit dusty at the cuffs from what may or may not have been a construction site. "She's at 39.1, Amara said, already moving past him. "We need to go now." I'm here. 53 minutes, Michael." He didn't respond. He simply took Chidera from her arms and carried their daughter to the car, and in that small act of competence, Amara felt the familiar, exhausting grief of loving someone's capacity for goodness while being unable to trust their consistency, like watching a man who could swim beautifully but kept choosing to stand on the bank while you drowned. They were 20 minutes from the hospital when Michael's second phone rang. Amara knew about the second phone. She had known about it for 4 years. It lived in his jackets in her pocket, never on the table, never left unattended, and she had made the private decision long ago to treat its existence the way she treated everything Michael refused to openly acknowledge, as information she was already holding, waiting for the moment it became useful. He silenced it the first time. It rang again immediately. "Answer it," Amara said, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. "It's nothing." "Michael," her voice was very quiet and very still. "Answer the phone." He answered it on speaker. She realized later, not out of honesty, but out of the panicked miscalculation of a man who had run out of hands to juggle everything he was carrying. Florence's voice filled the car like smoke filling a room, immediate, choking, impossible to pretend wasn't there. "Michael, it's David. He fell from the compound fence. He's unconscious. I'm at St. Nicholas right now, and they're saying possible head trauma, and I need you here. I need you here right now." The car went completely silent, except for Florence's fractured breathing on the line, and from the back seat, the small, feverish sound of Chidera shifting in her blanket. Michael's hands tightened on the steering wheel until his knuckles went pale. Amara watched his face in the amber glow of the streetlights, watched the moment she had predicted for 6 years finally arrive, watched it land on him like a physical weight, watched him finally understand that the two lives he had been carefully, meticulously refusing to allow to touch each other had just collided at full speed in the front seat of his own car. He had one child burning with fever in the back seat. He had another child unconscious in a hospital 40 minutes away. He had one phone call left before the choice he'd been avoiding for 6 years demanded to be made out loud. "Florence," he said carefully, "I'm on my way to the hospital with Chidera right now. She has a fever." "Michael, our son is unconscious." Florence's voice broke on the last word. "He's 6 years old and he's unconscious, and I need you here." Amara turned to look at her husband then, not with anger, not with tears, with the specific, devastating clarity of a woman who had prepared herself for this exact moment and still found, when it finally arrived, that no amount of preparation made it hurt any less. "Go," she said quietly. "Amara." "I said go, Michael. Take me to Lagos Island General first so Chidera is admitted, then go to your son." "I can't leave you at the hospital alone." "You've been leaving me alone for 6 years," she said, her voice dropping to something so quiet it barely registered above the hum of the engine. "Tonight is just the first time you're doing it honestly." They pulled into Lagos Island General at 9:47 p.m., and Michael carried Chidera through the emergency entrance with the focused urgency of a man trying to outrun his own guilt. The triage nurse took one look at Chidera's temperature, 39.6 now, climbing, and moved quickly, ushering them into an examination bay while a doctor was summoned. Amara handled everything. She answered every question, recalled every medication, described every symptom in precise, chronological order while Michael stood slightly behind her, present in body, but already absent in every way that mattered, his eyes flicking to his phone every 40 seconds with a frequency she counted without meaning to. When the doctor finally confirmed that Chidera's fever was responding to medication and that she was stable enough to monitor overnight without immediate alarm, Michael turned to Amara with an expression that mixed relief with something else, something she recognized as the beginning of a request he wasn't sure he had the right to make. She said again, before he could form the sentence, "I'll call Ngozi to come sit with me. Go to your son. Amara, I need you to know that this isn't Michael." She met his eyes steadily, the way she always did when she needed him to understand that she was done being spoken to carefully. "Your son is unconscious. Whatever you need to say to me can wait. That child didn't choose any of this. Go." He went. She watched his charcoal suit disappear through the emergency room doors and then turned back to her daughter, smoothing Chidera's hair back from her small, feverish forehead. Humming the same low hymn the night nurse had hummed the night Chidera was born, the hymn that had carried them both through the very first night Michael hadn't been there when he was supposed to be. Some things, it turned out, simply came full circle. Michael arrived at St. Nicholas Hospital at 10:34 p.m., 47 minutes after Florence's call, to find Florence in the corridor outside the pediatric ward with red eyes and shaking hands, her emerald silk blouse stained at the collar from where she'd pressed her face into it trying to muffle her own crying. David was conscious by then, which was the mercy of that terrible night. A hairline fracture to the left wrist, a mild concussion that the doctors wanted to monitor overnight, but no severe head trauma, no lasting damage. He was frightened and in pain and asking for his father with a persistence that the nurses said hadn't stopped since he regained consciousness. Michael walked into that pediatric room and found his 6-year-old son lying in a hospital bed, wearing a paper gown 3 sizes too large, his small wrist wrapped in a temporary splint, his dark brown eyes that looked, Amara had once noted with a pain she couldn't explain, startlingly like Chidera's, filling immediately with tears of relief the moment he saw his father in the doorway. "Daddy," David said, in the voice of a child who had genuinely believed, for a frightening few hours, that nobody was coming. And Michael Ez, who had spent 6 years trying to be 2 men in 2 places without fully being either, crossed the room and held his son, and wept, openly, without dignity, without the careful emotional management he applied to everything else in his life. He wept the way a man weeps when guilt and relief arrive at exactly the same time, and neither one is willing to let the other speak first. Florence stood in the doorway watching him hold their son, and felt, for the first time in 6 years of being the woman nobody chose first, something she hadn't expected to feel in that moment. Not triumph, not vindication, but a bone-deep exhaustion that had been building since the night she'd realized Michael was never going to love her the way she needed him to, and had simply kept going anyway because she didn't know what else to do. "He asked for you," she said quietly. "Every 2 minutes he asked for you, even before he was fully conscious, even when he didn't know where he was." "I know," Michael said, his voice wrecked. "I know, I'm here." "You were with her," Florence said, and there was no accusation in it, just the flat, exhausted statement of a woman finally saying out loud something she'd known for years. "Even tonight you were with her first. Chidera had a fever. She always has a fever, Michael, or a school play, or a birthday, or something. There's always something that puts her first and David second, and you stand there and tell me it's not about choosing, but I am tired." Her voice cracked on the last word, and she pressed her hand flat against the corridor wall as if she needed it to stay upright. "I am so tired of pretending that my son doesn't notice which family gets chosen when there's only enough of you left for one." Corridor was quiet around them. A nurse passed without looking up. Somewhere down the hall, a monitor beeped its steady, indifferent rhythm. Michael opened his mouth to answer, and what came out was not a defense or a denial or even an apology. What came out was the truth, 6 years late, devastating in its simplicity, arriving in that hospital corridor the way all long-delayed truths eventually arrive, without ceremony, without warning, without mercy. "I don't know how to fix this," he said. "I've been trying to fix it for 6 years, and I don't know how. I've been so afraid of losing either of you that I've been destroying both of you instead, and I don't know how to stop." Florence looked at him for a long moment. At this man she had loved desperately and resented bitterly and needed painfully for nearly 7 years, and felt something shift inside her that she couldn't immediately name. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't even understanding. It was something quieter, and in its own way more final than either, the feeling of a woman recognizing, with absolute clarity, that the person standing in front of her had just confirmed everything she'd suspected all along, and that confirmation, rather than destroying her, had simply set her free. "Go back to your wife, Michael," she said quietly. "Your daughter is in a hospital right now with a fever and no father beside her. Go back. David will be fine. The doctors said so. And I will be fine too. Eventually. Florence, go." Michael returned to Lagos Island General at 1:17 in the morning to find Amara exactly where he'd left her, seated beside Chidera's hospital bed, her sister Ngozi asleep in the chair across the room, the overhead light dimmed to a low amber glow. Chidera's fever had broken. She was sleeping soundly now, her small chest rising and falling in the peaceful, even rhythm of a child who has no idea how much weight the adults around her have been carrying. Amara looked up when he walked in. She looked at his face, at the red eyes, the ruined composure, the particular hollowness of a man who had just been forced to see himself clearly for the first time, and she said nothing for a long moment. She asked finally, "Concussion, fractured wrist. He's going to be okay." "Good," she said simply, and meant it, because whatever else was true, David was a child, and children in hospital beds deserved nothing but relief from the adults who'd put them there. Michael sat down in the chair beside her, elbows on his knees, hands pressed together, staring at the floor with the expression of a man trying to find something solid to stand on and discovering, too late, that he'd paved over every solid thing years ago. "Amara," he began. "Don't," she said softly. "Not tonight. Tonight we sit with our daughter. Everything else can wait until morning. I need you to know, Michael." She looked at him, and her eyes were dry, not because she wasn't feeling anything, but because she had cried every tear this marriage owed her years ago, alone, in rooms he hadn't been in. "I already know everything. I've known everything for 6 years. Tonight didn't teach me anything new about you. Tonight just made it impossible for you to pretend I didn't know." The silence that followed was the most honest thing that had existed between them in years. He sat. She sat. Between them, their daughter slept, unknowing, untroubled, breathing in the steady, even rhythm of a child who still believed the world her parents had built around her was solid. Outside, Lagos moved through its night, indifferent, enormous, full of its own 1,000 private crises and private griefs. And inside that dimly lit hospital room, the marriage of Michael and Amara came to its quiet, inevitable end. Not with a confrontation, not with shouting, not with lawyers or ultimatums, but with two people sitting beside their sleeping child and finally, after 6 years of carefully maintained illusions, simply telling each other the truth with their silence. The storm had been silent for 6 years. It had finally spoken, and what it said could never be unsaid. Dawn came to Lagos the way it always did, indifferent to the people it found still awake inside it, flooding the city in pale gold light that made everything look temporarily cleaner than it was. Amara watched it arrive through the hospital window, Chidera still sleeping beside her, Michael still in the chair across the room where he had eventually fallen into the shallow, restless sleep of a man whose conscience had finally stopped letting him rest properly. She had not slept at all. She had sat through every hour of that night with the quiet, alert stillness of a woman who had spent years preparing herself for a conclusion she always knew was coming, and had discovered, now that it had arrived, that preparation and readiness were not the same thing at all. She looked at Michael sleeping in that chair, at the face she had loved completely and trusted absolutely and rebuilt herself around, at the deep brown eyes now closed, at the jaw she had once found so reassuring in its steadiness, and felt something she had not expected to feel in that moment. Not anger. Not grief. Not even the cold satisfaction of a woman who had been proven right about everything she'd suspected. She felt tired. Profoundly, completely, down to the marrow tired, the kind of exhaustion that doesn't come from a single sleepless night, but from 6 years of carrying more than your share of a weight that should have been shared. From 6 years of loving carefully in a house built on sand while pretending, for your daughter's sake, that the foundation was solid. She stood up quietly, smoothed Chidera's blanket, pressed one long kiss to her daughter's forehead, and walked out into the hospital corridor. She called her sister first. Ngozi. I need you to find me a lawyer this week. A good one. Not for fighting, just for finishing. There was a pause on the line. Then quietly, I'll call you by noon. Thank you, Amara said. She hung up, stood for a moment in the pale morning light flooding the corridor, and breathed slowly, deliberately, the way she had learned to breathe through pain since she was 9 years old and the world had first shown her what loss actually felt like. Then she went back into the room, sat beside her daughter, and waited for Michael to wake up. He woke at 7, disoriented for a moment before the previous night assembled itself in his memory all at once. He looked immediately at Amara sitting upright, composed, hands folded in her lap, and knew, from the particular quality of her stillness, that something had shifted irrevocably in the hours he'd been sleeping. Want a divorce? She said quietly, not cruelly, not triumphantly. Simply, clearly, in the same direct voice she'd used to tell him Chidera's temperature was 39.1 the night before, the voice of a woman stating a fact that doesn't require debate. Michael closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, they were wet. I know, he said. I want you to understand something before we go any further with this, Amara continued, her voice steady. I'm not doing this because of last night. I'm not doing this because of Florence, or David, or any single thing you did. I'm doing this because I spent 6 years of my life being the woman you came home to, while never being the woman you truly chose. And I deserve, before I get too old to remember what it felt like to be whole, to find out what my life looks like when I'm not organized around managing the consequences of your choices. You are the woman I chose, Michael said, and the terrible thing about it was that he believed it, completely, desperately, the way only a man who has destroyed something beautiful can believe he valued it. No, Amara said gently. I'm the woman you kept. That's not the same thing. A man who truly chooses a woman doesn't make her call him 14 times from a delivery room. A man who truly chooses a woman doesn't build another house and call it a business arrangement. A man who truly chooses a woman doesn't make her sit alone in a hospital chair at 1 a.m, watching him sleep, wondering whether she ever truly mattered or was simply the most convenient option. Each sentence arrived with the quiet, devastating precision of a woman who had rehearsed nothing, who was simply, finally, telling the truth in its purest form, without performance, without anger, without any of the emotional armor people usually strap on before they say something that will change everything. Michael said nothing. There was nothing to say. The silence spoke louder than any defense he could have assembled. Need you to be a good father to Chidera, Amara continued. Whatever happens between us, I need you to show up for her consistently, honestly, without the compartmentalization that has defined everything else in your life. She deserves that. So does David, frankly. Neither of those children chose any of this. The least we can do is stop making them inherit the consequences of choices they had no part in making. Us? Michael asked, his voice barely above a whisper. There is no more us, Amara said. There hasn't been for a long time. We've just been too close to it to say it clearly. What followed in the weeks after that hospital morning was not a clean, cinematic dissolution. It was messy, slow, and painful in the specific way that endings are painful when they've been a long time coming, and both people involved know, somewhere deep and honest, that the ending is right. Michael moved out of the apartment he shared with Amara within the month, taking almost nothing, as if leaving his possessions behind was a form of penance he'd assigned himself. He found a flat in Ikoyi, alone for the first time in nearly a decade, and discovered in those first silent nights by himself exactly how much of his sense of self had been organized around the two women who had always, in their opposite ways, been waiting for him. With Amara gone, or rather, with himself removed from her orbit, the architecture of his double life collapsed inward. Florence, who had spent 6 years waiting to be chosen, found that being the only woman left did not feel the way she'd imagined it would. The fantasy she had nurtured through 7 years of second-place status had always contained a version of Michael who arrived, finally and fully, cleansed of his guilt and his other obligations, wholly present in a way he'd never been while divided. The Michael who arrived at her door in Ikoyi that December, hollow-eyed and heavy-shouldered, was not that man. He was a man whose certainty had finally been fully dismantled, who moved through rooms like someone who had forgotten how to take up space, who sat across from Florence at dinner and stared at the table between them with the expression of someone who had traveled a very long way to arrive somewhere and discovered, upon arrival, that he'd already lost what he came for. "Not here," Florence said one evening. Watching him push food around his plate with the mechanical disinterest of someone eating only out of obligation. "You're sitting in front of me and you're not here." "I'm sorry," he said. "Apologize," she said quietly. "Just tell me the truth. When you sit here with me, who are you thinking?" Looked up. Across the table, Florence Adiz, who had worn shimmering emerald gowns to his company launches and laughed in rooms until they reorganized around her, and loved him with an urgency that had once felt like everything, looked back at him with eyes that already held the answer she was waiting for him to confirm. "I'm thinking about what I threw away," he said. Florence nodded slowly, a small, devastated nod that carried 6 years of hopping compressed into a single movement. "I know," she said. "I've always known. I just wanted you to say it." She asked him to leave that night. He did. "And Michael Ez, who had built an empire on the principle that you verified the ground was solid before you built on it, who had once stood at a dessert table and told a woman in a pale dress that for anything that truly mattered, he took his time and didn't like getting things wrong, drove alone through the Lagos night, and understood, with a clarity that arrived 6 years and incalculable damage too late, exactly how catastrophically he had gotten everything wrong. Amara filed for divorce in January. It was finalized by April, the same month, not lost on either of them, that both their children had been born 6 years earlier. The settlement was straightforward. Amara asked for nothing extravagant, the apartment, a fair share of the marital assets, and a formal co-parenting agreement that specified Michael's obligations to Chidera in writing, because she had learned, at considerable cost, that verbal promises from this particular man needed the weight of documentation behind them to hold their shape. Michael agreed to everything without contest. It was, his lawyer noted privately, the least complicated dissolution he'd handled in 20 years. A man so consumed by guilt, he'd stopped arguing for anything he actually wanted. What Amara built in the year that followed surprised even Ngozi, who had believed in her sister's resilience since childhood, but had not fully anticipated the particular velocity with which a woman reconstructs herself once she finally stops using her energy to hold someone else's life together. The consultancy grew. 3 new clients in January alone, a partnership offer by March. By the end of that year, Amara Chukwu, she had quietly returned to her maiden name in September, not dramatically, not as a statement, simply as a woman reclaiming the name she'd been born with because it fit her again the way it used to, was running a firm of 4 accountants, serving clients across 3 states, earning more than she ever had inside the marriage. She moved into a new apartment in Lekki, smaller than the old one, brighter, full of afternoon light, and filled it with things she chose entirely for herself for the first time in a decade. Deep terracotta walls, plants she remembered to water, a reading chair by the window where she spent Saturday mornings with Chidera, both of them in their pajamas, reading companionably without the low-grade anxiety that had been the atmosphere of their previous home. "Do you miss Daddy?" Chidera asked once, on one of those Saturday mornings not looking up from her book. Amara considered the question honestly, the way she considered everything. "I miss who I believed he was," she said, "but that person and the real person turned out to be different men, and I've stopped grieving the one who only existed in my imagination." Chidera absorbed this, nodded slowly, turned a page. "I still love him," she said. "Is that okay?" "That's not only okay," Amara said, pulling her daughter close. "That's exactly right. He's your father, baby. Love him. Just know the difference between loving someone and trusting them. Those are 2 separate things, and knowing the difference will save you a great deal of pain someday." Michael Ez spent the year after his divorce in a particular kind of solitude that wealth cannot insulate you from, the solitude of a man who has finally been forced to sit alone with the full, unmediated truth of who he has been. Crestline Properties continued to operate. Business doesn't stop for personal reckoning, and Michael was, at his core, too disciplined to let his professional life collapse along with his personal one. But something essential had gone out of it: the certainty, the appetite, the infectious confidence that had once made rooms reorganize themselves around him. Colleagues noticed. Investors noticed. He noticed most of all. Florence moved on with a quiet dignity that cost her more than it appeared to. She accepted a senior design position with a firm in Abuja and relocated with David in April, putting physical distance between herself and the city where she had spent 7 years loving a man who never fully arrived. She didn't tell Michael she was leaving until 2 weeks before she left. A practical decision, she told herself, not a cruel one, though she understood that the line between those two things had, in her particular situation, always been uncomfortably thin. "David will still need you," she told Michael, the evening she informed him of the move. "Whatever happened between us, David is yours, and he needs his father. Don't make him pay for our mistakes the way we made ourselves pay for your choices." Michael drove to Abuja the following weekend, took his son to a park, bought him ice cream he barely touched, and sat across a small plastic table from a 6-year-old boy with his own eyes and Florence's nose and a quiet, watchful seriousness that reminded him, with a pain he hadn't expected, of Chidera at the same age. "Are you coming to live with us in Abuja?" David asked. "No, son," Michael said. "But I'm going to come see you. A lot. I'm going to be there the way I should have been all along." David looked at him, the particular measuring look of a child who has already been disappointed enough times to calibrate his optimism carefully. "You said that before," David said simply. "When you used to come on Sundays." Michael had no answer. He sat across from his 6-year-old son and received that truth the way all long-delayed truths eventually arrive, without ceremony, without the buffer of anyone else's interpretation, landing directly on the specific wound it had always been destined for. He visited David every 3 weeks after that. He showed up, consistently, which was more than he had managed while trying to maintain 2 households simultaneously. But presence, after prolonged absence, doesn't simply restore what was lost. It begins a different, harder work. The slow, unglamorous process of earning back the trust of a child who learned too early that fathers have exits. 2 years after the divorce, Amara received an invitation to a business gala at the Eco Hotel, a networking event for independent business owners across Lagos. She almost didn't go. The old version of herself, the one who had spent years making herself small and unobtrusive inside someone else's life, would have declined without hesitation. She went. She wore a deep burgundy gown, not borrowed, not inherited, not chosen to please anyone but herself, and walked into that room alone with the particular bearing of a woman who has been through fire and come out the other side not unburned, but clarified, stripped of everything that wasn't essential, left with only what was genuinely hers. Across the room, through the crowd, she caught a glimpse of Michael. He was there with a business associate, dressed in his old tailored charcoal suit, and she took this in with the detached precision of someone observing a fact rather than experiencing a feeling smaller than she remembered. Not physically. Something else. The certainty was gone, the easy confidence that had once made him look like the most solid thing in any room he entered. He saw her. Their eyes met across the crowd. She held his gaze for exactly 3 seconds, long enough to acknowledge that they had existed in each other's lives completely and catastrophically, long enough to say with silence everything that had already been said out loud in a hospital room 2 years ago. Then she looked away, not with cruelty, not with performance. Simply with the quiet, complete freedom of a woman who had laid down a weight she'd been carrying for years and discovered, in the laying down, that she hadn't needed it to hold herself upright after all. She spent the rest of that evening talking business, laughing genuinely, moving through a room as herself, fully, finally, without apology. She did not look back. Some choices cannot be unmade. They can only be lived with, carried forward into whatever comes next, their weight distributed across years until you learn or don't to walk without favoring the side they damaged. Michael Ez learned to walk differently. It was slower. It was quieter. It held none of the old swagger. But it was, for the first time in years, honest, the walk of a man who had stopped pretending the ground beneath him was solid and started, finally, doing the actual work of laying new foundations. Whether those foundations would hold was a question only time could answer. Chidera grew up with her mother's watchfulness and her father's stubbornness, exactly as he'd once whispered to her unborn self in the dark of a bedroom that no longer existed. She visited Michael on school holidays with a complicated, layered love, the kind that has absorbed the truth about someone and chosen to continue anyway, not out of ignorance, but out of a generosity larger than the wound. David grew up in Abuja, quieter than anyone expected, thoughtful in a way that sometimes alarmed Florence and sometimes filled her with a fierce, bittersweet pride. He saw Michael every 3 weeks without fail, and somewhere around his 8th birthday, stopped counting the visits as evidence against his father and started accepting them simply as what they were: imperfect, belated, genuine. Florence built a life in Abuja that was entirely her own, a thriving design practice, a circle of friends who knew her full story and loved her without requiring her to simplify it, a Sunday morning routine that didn't involve waiting for anyone to arrive. She stopped wearing emerald gowns to other people's events. She wore them to her own. And Amara Chukwu, who had learned at 9 years old that love was fragile, who had carried that knowledge through a marriage that confirmed it, who had built and lost and rebuilt herself more quietly and more completely than anyone watching from the outside could have tracked, sat on a Saturday morning in her terracotta-walled Lekki apartment with her daughter asleep against her shoulder, and a book open in her lap, and the kind of peace in her chest that doesn't arrive loudly. The kind of peace that arrives like dawn arrives, without announcement, without drama, simply there when you look up where darkness used to be. Some people enter your life like a promise. Some leave it like a lesson. The bravest thing a woman can do, the absolute bravest, is to know the difference between the two, and to refuse, even when it costs everything, to call a lesson a promise simply because she needs one. Amara Chukwu, 2 years, 4 months, and 11 days after the night everything split in two. Thanks for watching. If this story moved you, give it a like and share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories. See you in the next one.